This is Permissionless Liberty.
Welcome to Permissionless Liberty. I'm Dan Sanchez, here again with Adam Knott. Today, we are going to revisit the concept of coercion, which is obviously something that is a big concern for libertarians. And Adam has a specific way of looking at it, a specific way of defining it, which is very important because, as Voltaire said, if you wish to discourse or converse with me, first define your terms, because otherwise communication is not clear. So, Adam, how would you define coercion?
Thank you for the introduction, Dan. Well, let me start with an introduction from how Grok defines, AI defines coercion. I typed that into Grok about a week ago, and here's what Grok came up with for a general definition of coercion. Coercion refers to the act of compelling or forcing someone to do something against their will, typically through threats, intimidation, or other forms of pressure. It focuses on influencing behavior or decisions without necessarily involving a tangible gain for the coercer. So I like that definition. It basically says that the goal, well, let me see here. Yeah, I'll get into the goal of coercion later, but I like how it just immediately says that coercion means compelling someone to perform a certain activity or a certain action or a certain behavior. And then it continues, Grok continues, it encompasses a broad range of behaviors where one party influences or compels another's actions through pressure, threats, or intimidation. So that's I really don't have an argument with that. What I'm hoping to do this evening is refine that a little bit, but that's just your opening definition of what coercion is. And to me, as I see it, coercion is distinct from other forms of harm that I can do to somebody, such as assault or any physical harm I can do to somebody, or I don't know if threats in general. I don't want to go down that direction, or theft, for example. I can break into somebody's house in the middle of the night and steal something, and that's definitely a form of harm. And it's also a form of getting their belongings against their will, but it's not necessarily an example of coercion. So that's the first definition taken from Grok, and then we'll proceed from there. But before we go on, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think one distinction that's really useful to make is whether the consequence that is being threatened is a rights violation or not from a libertarian perspective. Because, for example, you could, threaten to fire someone and, like a boss who was like sexually harassing an underling, like the boss could threaten to fire them if they don't sleep with them. And, that's definitely highly unethical and deeply wrong. But is that coercion from the perspective of libertarian social theory? Like, would, or even like things that are less atrocious, like like threatening to cancel somebody's contract if they don't buy some other service or something like that. Which way are you thinking of it?
That the way I'm looking at it is that I'm purely looking at the act of coercion and what it entails, with the goal of trying to see, by gaining knowledge of what coercion is, to therefore see if I can almost like if you tried to figure out what a virus is or what a sickness is, so that I could see if I could cure it or see if I could find a solution to the actual act itself. In other words, act prevention, without regard to its morality or ethical standing from a libertarian or from any ethical perspective. So, for example, the example you gave, if somebody coerced somebody unethically, I'm going to, in my analysis, disregard the ethics of it to see, just to understand the coercion. So that the person, if I'm coerced unethically, let's say somebody tries to extort me, I still have to face the phenomenon of coercion as intended by that person who tries to coerce me. They're going to threaten me, regardless of whether they're ethically or morally correct in doing so. I still will suffer that phenomenon as long as they do it. So what I'm doing in my analysis is not trying to distinguish when coercion is justified, which is, I'm not saying that's improper to do. People engage in that activity, which is saying, when is it justified to use coercion? I do that in my life too. If somebody doesn't publish my essay, am I justified in coercing them? No, I'm not. Okay, so I don't do it. If they threaten me physically when I didn't do anything, am I justified in coercing them? I think I am. So that's the what I consider the moral or ethical side. But I can make a moral or ethical judgment about how the government's coercing me, and I can tell them, listen, you're being unethical. But if they persist in doing it, I have the option to try to see, well, how does this work? How when they go to do that, what are they actually doing? Let me see if there's a way that I can prevent that, so that, let's say they continue doing it. But if I can find a way to prevent that, or to shield myself, that's a second route to me to libertarianism, because what if I never change their mind and they keep trying to coerce me, but the difference between yesterday and today is today I figure out a way to protect myself, and so that when they do it, it doesn't work. Now, what does Adam mean by that? Okay, well, that's what I was hoping to explain as we go along.
Sounds good. Yeah, proceed, please.
Okay. Number 2, coercion as a form of trade or exchange. So I think I can convince most libertarians that coercion is actually not just a form of social harm, but that coercion, as it is intended by the coercer, is actually a form of trade or exchange. So what is the goal of coercion? In coercion, the primary or essential goal is not to harm someone per se, but to get them to perform a specific behavior or action. So again, I maintain that coercion is not the same thing as assault or murder or theft or fraud. In coercion, in order to get another party to do a specific behavior or action, I threaten that party with a harm. Then I offer to withdraw that harm in exchange for the behavior or action that I want them to perform. So now somebody may disagree with that definition, but that's what I will be advocating, or that's what I would advocate, that what's happening in coercion, and the reason it naturally becomes a social technique employed by government, is that their goal isn't to harm as many U.S. citizens as possible, or to kill as many as possible, or to defraud as many people as possible. What the essential thing they're after is obedience. So what they want is, if there's 10,000 laws, what the government ultimately wants is obedience to all 10,000 of those laws. So what the government essentially does is it says, we are going to, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So It's funny. I keep doing that. Anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is that before we get to the government's use of coercion, it's essentially a trade. So let's get away from that. Let's go to a typical one. Any use of coercion I can do. I'm on the street and somebody comes up and they start harassing me. I'm in my car and my windows are up and I'm at a stoplight and they come up and they start harassing me. So my coercion could be, if you don't stop doing that, I will XYZ. I will do XYZ. I'll call the cops, or I have a weapon. I say, if you don't stop doing that, I'm going to get out of this car and I have a weapon. So all I'm saying is, here's a harm. I'm threatening you a harm. Do what I say. Stop bothering me, or I will, do this harm. If you do what I say, I'll withdraw the harm. So it's going to be coercion is a form of trade. And so therefore coercion is very useful because since it's a social act or a social trade, it's one of the methods of getting something from someone. Of course, libertarians are expert at outlining techniques for voluntary trade. That's what our wheelhouse is. So our economic treatises all show how the system of voluntary trade can work. And voluntary trade works by offering someone or enticing someone to consider exchanging with you by offering them something so good or so tempting that they voluntarily, of their own volition, enter the trade. Coercion obviously doesn't work that way. Coercion is an alternative method that I have to obtain a good or a service from someone, where I threaten them with a harm. And then what I'm going to now offer them is the withdrawal of that harm for the thing that I want from them. So that when I say coercion, I don't mean just, that you did something that I'm mad about, or you did something that should be illegal. What I mean is this specific kind of trade that I was offered that I'm not very happy about, true, but it's just a fact of life that people offer those kinds of trades on a daily basis. When I read in Grok added this to its definition of coercion to show the universality of it. Grok said, manifesting in everyday social dynamics, interpersonal relationships, parenting, negotiations, or even evolutionary survival strategies, without necessarily requiring a formal structure or illicit gain. So, as Grok explained, and as I agree, coercion is just a phenomenon that as human beings we understand and we employ. If you don't eat your spinach, you're going to have to go to bed early tonight, you could say to your kid. That's coercion. Now, is it egregious coercion that should be combated with the deadly force? No, but it's coercion nonetheless. And Grok agrees that it is. Interpersonal relationships. Well, if you keep doing that, Susan, we might have to break up. That's a coercive trade. I have threatened to break up with you if you don't stop doing that. If you do stop doing that, I won't break up with you. So it's not, coercion doesn't to me automatically mean that somebody was immoral. It's consistent with either immorality or morality, but it's the phenomenon that underlies that happens regardless of how we judge it morally. So that's basically coercion as a form of trade or exchange.
Yeah, it reminds me of, have you seen the movie The Godfather?
Oh, how many times is the question?
So when his godson, Johnny Fontaine, comes complaining to him that a Hollywood studio head wouldn't give him a role. And
it well.
and so Vito reassures Johnny that he'll convince the studio head to give him the role. And Johnny's like, oh, how are you going to do that? And he's like, I'm going to make an offer he can't refuse, which is basically a death threat. But it's kind of in the language of a deal or of an exchange, and it kind of is that he's offering to not kill him in exchange for giving giving his godson the role.
It's a humorous way of taking something egregiously immoral or unethical and just getting to the pure dynamics of it. And that's the humor of it. In other words, what's so beautiful and humorous and about that phrase was that make him an offer he can't refuse. And so you think of commercial terms, wow, what would that be? But what he actually means is, if I'm going to tell him, I'm going to kill you, but if you do what I want, I won't kill you. So we're going to have a nice commercial trade here. It's going to be great. You're going to stay alive, and my nephew is going to get in the movies. It's going to be awesome. So coercion it's in a sense, I want to say humorously, it's a beautiful thing, because what I mean is it's something we all understand. There's no mystery behind it. So everybody who's a human being who is past the age of past childhood understands what coercion is, and maybe utilizes it to some degree, and therefore understands it when it's being employed on them. So that's hopefully that's something. When I joke that I can get libertarians to agree on that, that's all I mean, is that if we had enough intense discussion and could kind of break through the tendency to think of it in moral terms, if we could just think about it in purely mechanical terms, coercion is a certain thing. And of course, anybody who wants to go into government is required to get familiar with techniques of coercion, as our current president is, who started out in commerce. I'm just ad-libbing here, but Donald Trump mostly was involved in commerce, and he thought in terms of commerce. But as you can see in his second term here, he's starting to understand and become familiar with coercion a little bit more. Hey, I might do something militarily here. If you do this, I might think about withdrawing that military option. So he seems to be getting really familiar with it, and he is, after all, a government official. So it's not surprising that whereas maybe the past version of Trump spoke more in terms of economics and maybe win-win situations, making deals, and now he's more towards making offers that they can't refuse. And I don't think that's an accident. He's running an agency that is based on that. That's what they offer. They offer coercive trades. I don't mean that as a bad thing, because that's, if you look at, we're going to get into this, but anyway, so I won't get ahead of myself again. I was just wanted to ad-lib there a little bit. Coercive trades are something we're all familiar with, and government utilizes them basically to attain obedience from the citizenry. So should I go on to the next one, or do we have?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say real quick that, his famous book was The Art of the Deal. And so Trump prides himself as being a deal maker. And then he still, characterizes a lot of the shakedowns that he perpetrates now. But and so in a sense that it is a deal, but it's a coercive deal. But yeah, feel free to.
He probably leaves that part out.
Exactly.
It's a subtle. He's doing different kinds of deals a little bit more now than he used to, but he's not really interested in describing exactly why they might be a little different. But we all we understand. So okay, well, my next little section 3, is government reliance on coercion. That's where I was getting ahead of myself before. But so I asked Grok, based on the definition of coercion that you provided on my prompting, would it be accurate to say that government secures the obedience of its citizens through coercion? And when I asked that, I wasn't trying to get Grok to say, yeah, government, they're bad people. I just wanted to get to the point can we accurately say that coercion is what government does to get me to abide by the laws that it propounds? So Grok answered, based on the broad definition provided by Grok, where coercion encompasses influencing or compelling actions through pressure, threats, or intimidation as a universal human activity, It is accurate to describe government enforcement of laws via threats of fines, license revocation, entrance or access bans, apprehension, imprisonment, or bodily harm as a form of coercion to secure citizen obedience. So that there's nothing mystical about that. It's just, so the next section I have here is legislation as codified, collectively organized coercion. It sounds fancy, but legislation in its typical form specifies the behavior that is being requested. So legislation says, what you should do or what you should not do, whoever it's aiming at, whether that's aiming at, a specific group of people or just all citizens general. And then the legislation puts forth the harm that is being threatened, which harm will be withdrawn or withheld in exchange for the behavior being requested. So the way that I, as a citizen of the United States, avoid all those harms that are in the legislation is by doing all the activities that the legislation says I'm supposed to do. And I do that because I'm a law-abiding citizen. I don't want those harms. At least so far, I've made the decision that those harms are not worth me doing the activity, so I don't do the activity. So the legislation is basically almost like a coercion repository, or repository. I'm just making this up. A repository of ongoing coercion, or a repository of the current state of coercion, or something like that, where you can go to see if I don't want certain harms, if I don't want certain harms to happen to me, what do I have to do in exchange to have those harms be withheld? So it's basically a perpetual list. It's almost like something on the door of the castle that says, citizens, be aware, don't do these 20 things or the king's men will come and, take you away. So thus every law in existence. Go ahead, Dan.
In that regard, it's kind of like a contract, like a written contract, right?
Exactly. Again, with that twinkle in our eye that, it's like a contract you can't refuse in a way. Going with it really is. Without regard to how it came to be, whether that was a voluntarily entered into contract, but it is almost like a promise that if you don't do this, or if you do this, let's see, if you abide by what I have requested, I promise not to inflict these harms on you. So it is a kind of a contract. Yeah, definitely. So thus every law in existence, to the extent it adheres to this universal form of coercion, is an offer of a coercive trade. So thus, to the extent that every country has laws of this type, each law in the world could be understood as an instance or example of coercion, because it's basically a written, it could be spoken, it doesn't have to be written, it could be spoken, however it's communicated. It could be online, but basically it's a communicated request for behavior, a communicated harm that I'm planning to do to the coercee, and then an offer to withdraw the harm if they perform the requested behavior. So getting back to the example I always bring up is minimum wage. Adam, I see you're going into business over there. Number one, congratulations. Number two, you better pay that person $25 an hour. So I'm requesting that of you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to threaten to fine you. Of course, if you don't pay the fine, worse things will happen. But let's just start with the fine. I'll fine you. But if you do what I just requested, pay that person $25 an hour, I will withdraw the fine. So do we have a deal, or don't we? So anyway, so that's the third section. It's very simple. It says that the laws can be understood as a coercive exchange, and then what we're giving as citizens is obedience or conformance or whatever word you want to use, that we're behaving, we're doing what the law says, and the government's end of the deal is therefore they're not fining us or physically restraining us or any of a number of punishments. During COVID, their punishment was, well, here's the behavior we would like, Adam. We have a new product, medical product we have devised in record time, by the way. We would like you to inject that product. We understand you may be hesitant, maybe. There are some bad people who are hesitant. So we'll make a little trade offer. You can't go into the restaurants that you've been going into, and you can't fly on the airplanes you've been flying on. However, if you do inject the new substance we've come up with, we will allow you to go into the restaurants you've been going into, and we'll allow you to fly on those airplanes you've been flying on. So again, every law or everything the government does is based on coercion. And that's before we even get to whether or not we think it's proper, justified, moral, or ethical. It's a certain kind of technique that as human beings, we know is an alternative technique to get something from someone to the other technique we have, which is to offer them something that we think will make them actually happy. Like some money or a barter trade. Hey, I have this dishwashing machine over here, and I see you have a lawnmower. I'll give you my dishwashing machine if you give me your lawnmower. Or I have $100 and I see, you have a nice, again, lawnmower. So I'll give you my $100. You give me the lawnmower. There's another way to get things, and that is to threaten somebody with the harm. I'm belaboring the point. So anyway, legislation is basically a codification of the coercive trades being offered us by our government. That's the way to say it. So that concludes that section.
Yeah, I wonder if coercion is behind literally everything the government does. I definitely think that it's behind most of it, and especially with regard to the governed, like the people that they govern. But when I think of war and just dropping a bomb on someone, that's not that's just killing them outright. That's not like threatening to bomb them unless they do something. It's just, maybe there's attempted coercion that preceded it. That like,
that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
No, I agree. In other words, dropping bombs on somebody I wouldn't consider an example of coercion. Just like I was pushing someone to the pavement for no apparent reason, or breaking into their house in the middle of the night and stealing something from them. In other words, so I see coercion as a distinct form of harm. And hopefully before whoever dropped bombs on those people, they gave them they said, listen, here's what I need you to do, or I'm going to drop bombs on you. Hopefully they said that. They don't have to. But I would hope that anybody representing me, i.e. my government, would have tried what we call diplomacy, and then raise it to the level of threats or level of low-level coercion before they go to the ballistic option or the nuclear option. We're hoping that as civilized people, we first start to negotiate in good faith, and then if failing that, we have to say, well, start to propose things negative that we might do if our corresponding party, from our point of view, isn't being reasonable. But as soon as we start to propose a negative consequence, we're starting to engage in basically a universal phenomenon. So therefore, coercion and therefore coercion isn't necessarily always bad, quote unquote bad. It's just, as you might understand, a means to an end. In other words, aside from how we would judge it ethically, in any particular instance, it is a means to an end, just as a factual matter, or a means with which to an attempt to reach an end. Doesn't always succeed, but so we're going through here really nicely. And so my number 4 was that just without getting into specifics, if somehow, since coercion is so important for government, and since almost everything that I'm compelled to do is done via a coercive offer from government to harm me if I don't obey, my thesis would be that if there were some way found to lower coercion in general in society, however we might think about that, however we conceive that eventually, if the water level is lowering and lowering, that eventually, because coercion can only be lowered if instances of coercion are happening less. So eventually, a lowering of coercion would eventually impact government. Now, as soon as I say that, I think, oh, well, wait, couldn't government just keep coercing at its level? And then if coercion would just be lowering in society at large, independent of that. So imagine a society where all of the citizens' coercion is somehow going down, however we measure it. People are just coercing each other less than they used to, let's say, 6 months from now compared to today. But the level of government coercion is just maintaining at a stubbornly high rate, and it just isn't changing at all. My thesis would be, which is a topic for another day, but that you probably couldn't have a situation where, for whatever reason, coercion started to decline in the world, let's say, but that had no impact on the use of government coercion. So I'm going to assume that why would coercion decline society-wide? Well, I think we're going to get to that, but even before we get to any kind of scientific look at it, let's just say some amazing figure came up that we all admired, the whole world admired, and started to preach the negatives of coercion, of coercive social interaction. And somehow we all listened to that person or that group or whoever it was, and somehow coercion started to have a negative connotation. So then where I had planned to threaten somebody the next day to get what I want, I'd say, oh, according to Jerome, who I had started to listen to, he says, Adam, just give it some time. Don't necessarily jump to coercion. So that one day I just decided not to coerce when I was planning on doing it. And if that happened throughout society, you'd have a lowering in the level of coercion, let's say. But I would argue that the government can't remain impervious to that. Eventually, Adam is going to be somebody who's in government and is going to say, well, I was going to try to get this law passed to coerce this activity, these people who are doing this activity, but Jerome says coercion is ethically sketchy, ethically suspect. So I'm going to postpone, and I still reserve my right to coerce, but I'm going to postpone this legislation just a little bit. So I'm saying that if somehow if coercion, for whatever reason that we had not even yet specified, were to decline, government coercion would likely decline as well, along with societal use of coercion. And every single decline of government coercion, which is a legislation that gives a coercive threat, is an instance where it's not leaving the matter up to a voluntary, the person who's being threatened has no voluntary choice. So each law or each threat of coercion that would disappear from the government, whoever that threat is aimed at would now be free to do whatever they want in that area. So, for example, if the government has 1 million laws, let's say, worldwide, or 10 million laws, and somehow with coercion declining, only one senator or congressman or one government decided to postpone or repeal one law, and let's use our example of minimum wage. Just that one instance of a retraction of coercion, of the coercive trade, now means that everybody would be free to engage commercially at the wage of their choice, which is a libertarian concept. So what I'm trying to, paint a picture is that as I see libertarianism, as I have been able to think it through over the years, um, if there was some way to lower coercion generally by showing by whatever method that government coercion would have to decline and individual liberty necessarily would expand, because government coercion is what's preventing liberty from emerging. So I have some examples there, but before I do, I want to stop and see if you have any reactions to that.
No, that all makes sense. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear the examples.
Okay. Now, yeah, I'm not. You notice I didn't say it's likely we could find that. I didn't promise we could find that, but but I did. Okay, so how might a reduction in coercion be achieved? So I've used this example before, but I think even in the times where I brought it up before, it's not always clear how profound some of these things are. Sometimes you have to hear them a number of times or think about it a number of times before you see it. But let's use the example of Bitcoin again. So I think it's fair for me to say that I know Bitcoin pretty well because I've known about it since around 2013. As we talked about, you and I were on the Mises forum. That's when AJ, one of the forum contributors, started to inform us about Bitcoin. And that was probably sometime in 2012. So I started to learn a little bit about it, and just as a concerned citizen, as a concerned libertarian, I've learned enough about it to kind of understand what it is. But I don't think it's widely understood how profound of a discovery it is. And the reason is, if you consider how Bitcoin works in relation to what we've been discussing today, the coercive trade, most people talk about Bitcoin as peer-to-peer currency. So if I'm talking to a layman and I say, there's a peer-to-peer currency, I think what they will imagine is two people directly exchanging. So it's in the Bitcoin literature, it's pretty common to see that Bitcoin is peer-to-peer, where the third party has been eliminated from the transaction. So in other words, if I send Bitcoin to somebody in Italy, it's purely peer-to-peer, Adam sending to Alejandro in Italy, and the government has been eliminated from the pathway of the exchange. So that's one of the great innovations of Bitcoin. So, but the way that's described, it makes it sound like I'm actually peer-to-peer course dealing with Alejandro, so that any social interactions that I can do to another person that would apply, anything that Alejandro could do good things to me or bad things to me, I can do good things or bad things to Alejandro. So because it's just peer-to-peer, but the government won't be interfering. But that's not what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin actually is more radical than that. It's actually almost, in a sense, single person commerce, because when I transact with Bitcoin, the second person, in other words, it's a way of transacting and exchanging, sending something to Alejandro without actually dealing with another person at all. So I'll demonstrate what I mean by that. I mean, let's say I meet with Alejandro in November of last year, and I promised that Alejandro I would send him some Bitcoin in January of 2026, and we agreed. So I wrote it down on a piece of paper. Now it's January 2026, and Alejandro is giving me his address, his Bitcoin address. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that address in, and I'm just going to hit send. And so what's going to happen is the network, which is just functioning in the background, which is totally anonymous is even a bad word. It's almost like a network that's almost impersonal. It's almost like automatic. And what's going to happen, that I won't observe, is that Alejandro's Bitcoin wallet is magically going to appear the digital currency. But where I'm going with that is, actually, though you could say that I sent that I peer-to-peer exchange with Alejandro, nowhere in that transaction did Alejandro or I have a chance to coerce each other, because the means of doing so have been eliminated by the means we chose to exchange. It eliminated the option for coercion as much as it itself. What I'm trying to say is, if Alejandro and I had decided to exchange Bitcoin person to person, to meet at a Starbucks with our iPhones or smartphones and exchange it, I would have an opportunity to coerce him and he would have an opportunity to coerce me, because we would be directly exchanging. It would be peer-to-peer, would be a person-to-person exchange. But the significance of Bitcoin is that, in a very important way, notwithstanding every objections or like the possible complications with what I'm saying, it basically eliminated the person-to-person aspect of the exchange in a way that prevented certain types of social human behaviors to occur between the two people. And that's not understood about Bitcoin. As we talk today, as we discuss this today, I can guarantee you, I can't guarantee it. I think I can get agreement from my libertarian friends that the people don't realize the full significance of what the Bitcoin network is demonstrating as proof of concept, that the lowering of coercion can be achieved by introducing forms of exchange between people in which coercion is, if not impossible, extremely difficult. So therefore, once those are introduced, once those forms of exchange are introduced, regardless of whether somebody wants to coerce somebody, the opportunities for coercion decline to the extent that these methods of exchange expand. So that was my first example, but I have a very more simple example, but I wanted to pause for a second in case you wanted to have a comment or a question or something.
Yeah, well, wouldn't that aspect of it be true of any kind of remote payment, like that, even if it wasn't cryptocurrency, like if with like PayPal or Venmo or something like that?
Well, that's a great question. I would agree that a transaction between you and I by PayPal, in a sense, eliminates my opportunity to coerce you that I would have if we transacted face to face. But I think you would agree that when I transact by PayPal, PayPal has the opportunity to coerce me. And they're going to say, Adam, I've been watching a podcast you've been doing over there. Very nice young two men. And you guys seem to be laughing it up and having a great time, but you seem to be propagating a lot of misinformation, meaning politics that don't agree with their politics, of course. So we have an offer for you. We have a harm. We're going to shut you down and stop you from transacting. Your business relies on that? Oh, well, I'm so sorry. We have people who write nice letters that start with, I'm so sorry. You mean, you need the money. You're going to send money to some protesters in Canada? We're so sorry. We suggest you find other means of funding them. Oh, but that's not actually not that bad. We have a trade. If you stop spreading misinformation, we won't shut down your account. If you stop talking about politics that we don't agree with, we won't shut down your account. So what my lighthearted comment showed the beauty of Bitcoin in that it also eliminated opportunities from coercion from the payment processor. So, I mean, it's so profound that that's why I have a strong intuition that Bitcoin is a quote unquote libertarian technology. Can technology be libertarian? Did the universe see Bitcoin to say you are libertarian? No. What I mean is it's libertarian in the sense that it prevents certain types of human harms from occurring, regardless of the morality of the people who are operating. They're not provided the mechanism to engage in certain forms of social harm. So that's the significance of Bitcoin, and obviously, in my mind, it's so obvious why the Biden administration wanted to get rid of it, because the flip side of that is anybody who wants to maintain that coercive option necessarily has to be against forms of social interaction that prevent those social interactions. So they're 100% correct in being against Bitcoin, correct from their own point of view. If they want to maintain a system where they can control my behavior through a coercive exchange, they don't want a system where they're not the third party that could coerce me, where they're eliminated from the transaction. So, but it's not our prospects are way better than that, because Bitcoin didn't invent that function. So the most beautiful example you'll ever hear probably about how to do this is the invention of the vending machine. And I use it a lot in my writing. And I just like to use a vending machine in a hallway somewhere, some building. And there's some Snickers bars in there, because I think Snickers bars are kind of universal candy. And the Snickers bar is in there. And that's an example of what I would call social exchange without social interaction. That's how I refer to it. And so what I mean is that I can exchange with the person who's providing the Snickers bar, because I'm going to leave money in the machine. The person's going to leave a Snickers bar, and we're going to do an exchange. So it'll be a social exchange. There's another person, but I won't directly interact with that person. I never have to know who that person is. I never have to talk to them. That person may live 10 miles away, 20 miles away. I don't even know when that person shows up to restock the machine, and I don't really care. But when I go to the machine, I put in my money, and then I get the product. So it's a social exchange. I'm pretty sure, we can agree on that. And to the extent that I define social interaction as direct, as long as I qualify it, meaning, and I don't define it another time. Basically, it means whenever I'm aware that I'm addressing a person, or whenever a person's aware they're addressing me, then we have direct social interaction. So my point is that Bitcoin didn't invent the idea that you could have a technology to do social exchange in which the options for coercing somebody to do that kind of social exchange were diminished or eliminated. And so the way that coercion could be lowered in society, potentially, in other words, I'm not sure, I don't have a plan here to tell us how to put vending machines in everybody's room, but if, to the extent that we involve in social exchange where the other person isn't present, to that extent, we have, in a sense, eliminated, or you could see how it would eliminate potentially an opportunity for coercion. And my point isn't that if we do vending machines, then the government won't be able to coerce us. That's not my point. But my point is that if kinds of exchange that don't require direct person-to-person social interaction start to infiltrate or start to expand in society, just in general. So if Bitcoin starts to expand, as a great example, right now in the world, the percentage of people in the world that use Bitcoin is is pretty minuscule. I mean, it might be 50 million people, maybe. I mean, I don't know, but it's some very small number compared to the world population. So to that extent, that's the extent to which this form of social exchange has eliminated certain types of social exchanges, such as coercion. So it's only a very small amount. So you could do a thought experiment where you say, well, what if Bitcoin were used by half of the population? Well, if it was, that sometime that has to start to come at the expense of a payment processor that was going to use a coercive trade. It's just kind of it's almost a statistical or logical argument. I don't have to pinpoint who and where and why that would happen. I can just say that if Bitcoin went from 1% or 2% use of the whole world population to, let's say, 50%, I mean, which is technically possible, that social exchange volume has to come at the expense, very, very likely has to come at the expense of other forms of financial exchange where somebody was in a position to leverage coercion against the exchangers for whatever reason they wanted to, whether it's political, religious, whatever the objection that third person had for not liking what the two exchangers are doing, that third person had an option to employ coercion because that person was involved in the transaction. So to the extent that that person would be eliminated by a form of social interaction that doesn't require face-to-face direct social interaction, by the extent that person is eliminated, now coercion isn't part of my of something I have to be concerned with in that small area, not the world in general. Somebody can still come to my door. Somebody can still, there's all sorts of threats that, but I'm saying as that form of interaction starts to increase, then there's a certain logic necessity that then coercion has to decrease. So when I'm thinking about how the prospects for a libertarian society, I'm thinking how, knowing what I just said, what can we do? What can be done? So I think the internet was the first promise of that, but that's, as we spoke last time, that's kind of been co-opted by corporate ownership, which, as I explained, was too connected to government. Corporations aren't neutral; they're connected to the existing, the ruling government of their country. So government policy comes in. So therefore, they're not neutral. So they introduced a third coercive party into our transactions on the internet, which we had when we had all the censorship issues where the platforms were shutting people down for COVID. And we learned that the platforms aren't neutral, and then they're not just neutral platforms of exchange of ideas. We were dispelled of that notion and realized that we are very vulnerable to the corporations being pressured by governments. So the government was coercing the corporations to coerce us, basically. So, I mean, everything's understandable. The corporations got coercive offers from government. You will be brought in front of Congress and you will be in big trouble. But you won't be in big trouble if you shut these accounts down. And then the corporations in turn said, or the social media company in turn said, you're going to have your account shut down. But if you stop with the opposition party talk, we won't shut you down. So, my point here is just that the original promise of the internet didn't evolve in the way I think that we would have hoped, which is a neutral platform where the government doesn't intervene. That's just not the way it's happening. But Bitcoin is another step in that direction, and it's much harder for the government to intervene. To the extent that that Bitcoin doesn't get shut down, it's kind of impervious or resistant to censorship and to coercion. So what the government has to do is, since our economy is still a dollar economy and the government controls the dollar economy, it has to go to those choke points if it wants to tell me something that I have to do, it has to go to its system that it controls, which is the dollar system. But if I stay within the Bitcoin system, I can send and receive Bitcoin. It's not that I can't. Nobody could threaten to coerce me, but there's no means within the system of Bitcoin to leverage coercion. But I guess what I want to conclude by saying is that the principle involved is that there's such a thing as social exchange that does not entail social interaction. And to the extent that that form of social exchange expands, to that same extent, by and large, and over time, must certain types of interaction decline. And the way I see it is that marks the dividing point between the two struggling parties of humanity. Why you kind of intuitively know that certain parties are anti-technology, or certain groups are anti-technology, and certain groups are pro-technology. And it kind of has to do with the intuitive knowledge that we all have that the advance of technology has a certain feature to it that if it expands, that's going to be to my benefit. That I'm going to experience less and less of this other thing that I don't like. And anybody who wants to do that, therefore, sees the development of technology as a negative, because they're planning to do that as their vision of how society should work. So they're planning to if you're planning to leverage coercion as the foundation of your view of society, a very large government that regulates everything and it's dependent on all those coercive trades. If one after the other, those start to get eaten away at by new forms of social interaction, where the option of coercion is hampered, severely hampered, you're not going to be happy with that development. So, in my mind, Gary Gensler and Elizabeth Warren and the Biden SEC and banking commissions were extremely hostile to Bitcoin, and there's a very, very good reason for that, because they see a world in terms of a one world order where there's an overarching government and everything's controlled, and that's how they see it. Whereas I see it as a world of expanding freedoms where nobody's in control and it's decentralized. And every day there's new freedoms emerging. So when I see Bitcoin, I think of I'm a happy person. But if your view of society depends on government, which employs coercion as its primary method, there is no other method that they have come up with to control behavior other than coercion. So it's a very serious issue for both sides. And so I'll just conclude real quick I'll just summarize what we talked about. Coercion is a specific type of trade or exchange. The goal of coercion is to obtain a specific behavior on the part of the coercee, the person who's coerced. So when I coerce somebody, I may or may not be looking for a tangible good from them. I may just want them to do something, like behave, or don't go over there, don't do this, or don't. So it's a broad. What I'm asking of the other person when I coerce is very broad. It could be anything I want them to do. So I could actually coerce them for a financial benefit or a piece of property, but that's only part of what I could get from them if I coerce them. There's also basically what I'm looking for is them to do what I ask them to do. Coercion is the foundation of government and legislation. That's not meant as a criticism. It's just a fact that's what they do. Mises said words to that. If he said they're compulsion and violence. That's one way of saying it, but a more neutral way of saying it is to say that they leverage coercion in order to attain obedience or compliance to their laws. My thesis or contention is that an overall decline in the use of coercion globally or on a society-wide basis would of necessity eventually catch up with government. In other words, however that declined, whatever the mechanism that made it decline, would infiltrate into government affairs at some point and start to decline their coercion as well. And every law that it affected that got repealed or that didn't get enacted would be an instance where the individuals were free to transact voluntarily. So that any lessening of government coercion, the flip side of that is an increase in liberty. Because if the government stands back and says, Adam, we're not going to do this law, what I hear is, Adam, you're free to do it the way you want to do it. So all I need for Christmas is for government coercion to decline, even small at first or a little bit, and I'll look and see which ones those are, that what laws are being repealed or not getting initiated, and I will know that those are freedoms that I'm getting or maintaining. So so to tie it all together, that's the importance of coercion. That's why coercion is so important to libertarian social theory, as I would argue, because it's the focal point. It's what everything else is built on the government side.
Very good. Thank you for sharing this perspective. I think it's a really promising one in terms of identifying exactly what kinds of technologies, techniques, methods that free people can create to reduce opportunities for coercion and thereby make the government just be less able to coerce, just not from any change in legislation and not necessarily even in any change of ideology, but just in a change of just the way things are going. And I think Bitcoin is definitely sort of like the number one example of that. And it'd be great in future episodes to talk about other examples that exist or other examples that might come to exist in the future.
Yeah,
Well, great,
it's really exciting, and it gives one hope. And I will leave this out there for the viewers, that this isn't new. What I'm saying isn't new. It's been going on. So if you think about the development from a primitive society, and then you go up to, let's say, a very primitive society, then you go up to a society where there's traveling people traveling on horse or camel to do commerce. And then you go up to a society in which there are small villages. And then you go to the next step in society where there's maybe larger villages. And the way they trade, you could conceptualize the evolution as an evolution of doing social exchange without doing social interaction. Because if you imagine a very primitive society in a band of 20 or 30 people, there's really only one way you can get something from someone. You have to go up to them face to face, and you have to, hopefully they're nice to you, and then that's how you're going to get something. But as you go forward, what happens is, or I would argue, so when you're in the more primitive, there's a lot of mind to mind, let's say, activity that has to happen. And then as you go up, let's say if we take it halfway to now, and you have a store situation where there's let's say some goods in a window, and they have the prices, and the person who is operating the store is in there, but you can't actually see them. But if you walk through the door, you'll see them, but they're in there. So now you've separated part of your shopping activity from a direct person-to-person interaction. So that person's in the store and they're in the back corner there, or they're back by their cash register, but you're about the window deciding about your purchase. But then if you go all the way till now and you think about Amazon, and I use Amazon quite a bit, and now I'm totally used to now doing almost all of my shopping without ever encountering a person. So there's something to this, that we could see evolution in a sense. We can see evolution in lots of different ways. It's biological or economic or intellectual. There's all sorts of evolutions, but one of the evolutions that we can see is a growing technology, if one will, by which we can exchange socially without directly interacting. And I would argue, and most people would agree, that today we have a large opportunity for that. So I guess the question for libertarians is, how could that be applied to our relationship with the government in the way that Bitcoin did? So how can that be applied, or how can we use that concept and maybe speed evolution along a little bit, so that coercion is less effective in reaching us, or reaches us less. So that's all I have.
All right, that's a great way of an alternative perspective of just looking at history, just looking at the history of civilization. And that could be another episode, is just kind of a more historical based one. But that'll be a great place to leave it. And thank you so much, Adam Knott. And I will see you at the next episode.
Thank you, Dan.